We begin tonight with breaking news as reaction to a state Supreme Court ruling pours in. In a 4-3 decision, the court ruled former President Donald Trump cannot appear on the Colorado primary ballot, a decision that is sure to be challenged to the U.S. Supreme Court. Tonight, we look at what this decision means for Colorado voters and what Trump's Republican opponents are saying. We begin our coverage with political specialist Sean Boyd. And Sean, the entire country now watching to see exactly how this plays out.
This ruling, if it holds, could change the course of the 2024 presidential election. While there have been similar legal challenges in dozens of other states, the Colorado Supreme Court is the first to rule on the merits of such a case, finding that former President Trump engaged in an insurrection and as such is ineligible to ever hold any public office again. In a 132-page opinion, the majority justices noted the gravity of their decision, saying, "We do not reach these conclusions lightly," noting they travel in uncharted territory as the first court in the nation to find former President Trump engaged in an insurrection. They said they had little difficulty reaching the conclusion that his actions leading up to and on January 6 constituted overt, voluntary, and direct participation in an insurrection. But they disagreed with the lower court on whether Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars insurrectionists from holding office, applies to presidents, saying President Trump asks us to hold that Section 3 disqualifies every oath-breaking insurrectionist except the most powerful one, and that it bars oath breakers from virtually every office, both state and federal, except the highest one in the land. They barred the Secretary of State from placing his name on Colorado's primary ballot or counting write-in votes for him, but delayed the ruling from taking effect until January 4th, when Colorado's ballot needs to be set. Trump's attorneys vowed to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Certainly, a lot of people are going to be spending the holidays thinking over this quite a bit.
Mario Nicolais represents the 6 Colorado voters who filed the lawsuit. He says he's confident the nation's highest court will uphold the state court's ruling.
One of the things that you'll find in this ruling is some of its reliance is based on writings of Neil Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch, and what he had to say about protecting ballots from people who did not belong on them.
But the ruling wasn't unanimous. 3 judges dissented. Justice Maria Birkenkotter said the court didn't have the authority to consider the case. Chief Justice Brian Boatwright said removing Trump from the ballot would require an insurrection-related conviction, which doesn't exist. Justice Carlos Samore went even further, saying Trump had been denied due process. What took place here doesn't resemble anything I've seen in a courtroom, Samore wrote. Parties are always allowed to conduct discovery, subpoena documents, and compel witnesses. The irregularity of these proceedings is particularly troubling given the stakes. Justice Samore also worried about potential chaos if other states began disqualifying Trump. The ruling only applies to Colorado, but other state courts and even secretaries of state could use the ruling as justification to keep Trump off the ballot as well. And here is why that matters. If Trump isn't on a state's primary ballot, he doesn't get delegates from that state. And if enough states disqualify him, he may not have enough delegates to secure the Republican nomination.
Now, Sean, you had said that the state Supreme Court's decision does not take effect until January 4th. Right. So what happens if Trump appeals, but the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't issue a ruling until after that date? Then what's next?
So Trump's name remains on Colorado's primary ballot. But if the U.S. Supreme Court upholds the state Supreme Court's ruling, any votes for Trump wouldn't count.
All right. Big
a lot
news
at stake.
Today. Yeah, certainly so. Sean, thank you so much. Alan Janae, of course, working on this breaking story for us tonight. And Alan, Trump did not address the ruling during a campaign event tonight, but his Republican opponents sure are talking about it.
Well, they took that opportunity, Karen. Nikki Haley said tonight, we don't need judges making these decisions. She said, I want to see this in the hands of voters. But any use of the 14th Amendment, which has been done only a handful of times since the decade after the Civil War, seems bound for the courts.
Trump! Donald Trump this night was in Iowa ahead of the caucuses in mid-January there. He did not address the Colorado court's decision, But his campaign called the ruling, quote, completely flawed and a scheme by the left wing to interfere in an election. Among other Republican campaigns, there was opposition to the court's move.
That's not America. I stand strongly against that. And I think that whoever it is, it should be the people of this country that decide, not some judicial system that decides.
I don't believe that it's good for our country if he's precluded from the ballot by a court. I think it's bad for the country if that happens. I also have very strong feelings of the fact that people in this country deserve to have a trial before rights are taken away from them.
From candidate Ron DeSantis, a tweet saying the left invokes democracy to justify its use of power, even if it means abusing judicial power to remove a candidate from the ballot based on spurious legal grounds. SCOTUS should reverse. The Supreme Court may well act quickly because the primary ballot will get certified January 5th, and Colorado's Secretary of State says she'll do whatever is decided.
It's my job to follow the law, uphold the Constitution, and listen to courts. I will follow whatever order or decision is in place by the time I go forward to certify the presidential primary ballot.
Now, the Trump administration, of course, has already vowed to challenge the ruling with an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. The issue is really almost sure to go to the highest court, whether it was over Colorado or some other state, because there are now challenges to Donald Trump's name on the ballot filed in over 25 states. Karen.
All right, so much more to come on this. Alan, thank you.